What is up, everyone? Jeremy here. Welcome to another video in my In the Mix series, the video series dedicated to everything mixing and building a great mix. This is actually video number 2 in a series of videos where we're walking through an entire session for a track I put together and was featured on my OD guitar reveal video. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the drums. This includes what drum VST I use, what drum samples I use, and how I use them to reinforce the main drums, a few techniques I use to enhance and add width to the mix through the drum rooms, and more. There is a lot to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so the first thing we're going to do is go ahead and listen to the full mix, and then I'm going to just solo the drums so you can hear those. Then we'll break down how I mixed these drums completely. So here is a sample of the entire session. All right, that is the full mix, the entire session. So now I'm going to solo the same parts with just the drums, and here they are. All right, so those are the drums soloed. So let's go ahead and start breaking down how I mix them. And we'll start with the drum VST that I use for this. And if you follow my channel, if you're a subscriber, you know I use Get Good Drums Invasion, and that is what I used on this as well. So let's just go ahead and break down what this looks like. So starting with the kick, you can see all the settings on the screen here. I'm not gonna read them all. You can screen capture these and just kind of look at everything in more detail later. But because there's a lot to cover in this video, I'm not gonna read every single setting, but those are the settings there. The one thing I do wanna call out specifically here is in Get Good Drums, they have what's called a turbo function or setting, and it's right down here. If I turn it on, and I have this dial here, and what that does is it just activates a built-in pre-processing that they have done to whatever I turn the turbo setting on. So if it's the kick, it'll affect just the kick or the snare or the rooms or whatever. I have the turbo setting off on everything. It's all off, and that's because I want just the raw drum tones coming through that I can process how I want them. So that's the one thing I want to call out here specifically. But you can see all the settings for the kick there, and the one I'm using is the Pearl Master Birch 22x16. Then we go to the snare, and I'm using the Brady Tasmanian Blackwood 14x6.5. You can see all the settings I have there. All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the toms. And here they are. Here are the settings. You can see I'm using the Yamaha RC series toms. You can see all the different panning and settings and levels there. The two things I want to call out here is on floor tom. Let's see, she's got floor tom 2, floor tom 3. I've got the attack, hold, and decay settings adjusted here, and this is because these toms they ring out a lot, and especially this Tom 2 and Tom 3, when you hit it, the actual bass that just like rings out and holds afterwards, it's very deep and it's very heavy, and it can completely destroy your low end in the mix. So I adjusted the attack, hold, and decay settings here to account for that, so that you get more of the attack, less of the decay, basically. And the other thing I want to point out here real quick is I did leave a little bit of the turbo setting on for the rooms, specifically for the toms that are going to the room mics. And that's because I just couldn't find a real great way to process them the way that I wanted it. without affecting the other instrument or the other pieces of the kit that are also going to the room as well. So I kind of took the simple approach here and just left some of the pre-processing built into GGD on for the toms going to the room specifically. All right, next up we have cymbals, and nothing fancy here. You can see the levels I've got going on and the panning, and then you can see the individual cymbals we've got here. You can see all of them there. Again, not going to read everything, but then we have the settings for the cymbal mixer. This is important because I've actually pulled back the levels a good bit for the rooms on the cymbals, because the normal levels are much more higher. Like you see on the overheads up here, they're like looking at this slider here, it's usually like way up here. I pulled these back a good ways because of the way that I'm processing the rooms, and we'll get to that later. But anyways, it was adding a lot of cymbal into the overall mix because of how I'm processing the rooms. So I just cut back the levels of the cymbals going into the room mics. So that is the cymbal mixer, and we'll actually go ahead and just take a quick look at the full kit. You can see that's what the full kit looks like with all the pieces, the toms, the cymbals, and the snare and the kick and everything. I've got the CPU scaling on medium. You can see the reverb and master levels there. So that is the VST and all the settings inside Contact. Now, all of those individual instruments map to individual tracks in the DAW, and we're going to break all those down now. And we're going to go ahead and get started with the kick drum. So the very first plugin I have here is a channel strip plugin. This is by SSL. It is called Channel Strip 2. You're going to see this a ton across a lot of the individual pieces of the drum kit here in these tracks in this mix. Just know this is basically a way for me to consolidate EQ, noise gate, compressor, and level control all in one plugin. So when you see this, just know that's what it's mainly used for. You can use whatever EQ or noise gate or compressor you want. So you can see the settings I've got going on here. Again, I'm going to hover over them so you can read the numbers. I'm not going to say everything because this is going to take a long time if I do that. So you can see the high pass, the low pass. We've got pulling back a little bit here, 11,000 hertz or kilohertz looks like, 320 hertz we're pulling back a little bit, and at 52 hertz we're pulling back a little bit there. We've got some compression going on. This is essentially just reducing it at max about -3 dB. See this yellow bar right here, this is going to show the compression. If I play the drums here, it's going to show almost no reduction here. Let's see. You can see it's just lighting up on the bottom very, just a little bit, and that's at like -3 dB. So it's not doing a ton. Let's see, the next thing we have is the snare drum, or actually no, I'm sorry, we've got one more thing in the processing the kick drum, and that is the virtual tape machine by Slate Digital. And this just basically adds some saturation, subharmonics, and so it beefs up the low end a good bit without being too boomy. So I thought this sounded really good on the kick, so I left that. The only other thing in here is a gain plugin, and this is just essentially so I can pull back the level without having to move the slider a whole ton. And then we have some sends going to a punch bus and a room bus, and we'll get to the buses in a little bit, so stick around for that. And next up we have the snare drum, and specifically that's the snare top and the snare bottom. And you can see the processing looks almost identical across the two. The biggest difference here, you can't tell from here, but is the gain. So this is the snare top, we're pulling back 7 dB, and the snare bottom we're pulling back 14. So the snare bottom is way back in the mix, and that's because I don't like a ton of snare bottom in my mix. I want more of that snap from the top of the snare. But running through the individual settings on the snare top, you can see with the channel strip settings here, here's the high pass, the low pass. We're pulling back a little bit at 14,000 kilohertz just because this is a very snappy snare. And I'm also doing top-down processing on my master bus where I'm adding top end anyway, so I just pulled it back a little bit there. Let's see, we're boosting up a little bit of the upper mids, pulling back just a little bit of the lower mids, and then you can see we're boosting up, adding a little bit of beef here at 84 hertz or so. Let's see, we've got no dynamics. The dynamics are not engaged, so there's no compression happening here, so that's essentially it. Then we go into the virtual mix rack, and this is an emulation of a distressor by Empirical Labs, I believe is who makes that. And this thing does, it's essentially a compressor that also adds different forms of like saturation, distortion, and it really does a lot to a snare drum, and that's why I've got it on here. You can see the settings that I've got. Then we're adding, the next two are just essentially to add more beef to the snare, and I will toggle these on and off so you can hear the difference. But this is transgressor 2, and the red is processing the transient, the blue is the sustain as it says, and you can see the settings I've got on that plugin there. Then we go into spiff, and this is, let's see, I'm not sure how exactly to describe this. It's not necessarily like transient control, because you can process the transients and the sustain differently, but this thing is super powerful. You get these individual bands in which you can process the signal, and you can have it either add to the signal, enhance that signal, or subtract from it. It is completely dynamic, and it's really awesome. And I'll toggle this on and off here, but you can see the bands here. I've got a high and a low pass, really small here. It's only between let's see, 270 hertz and around 70 hertz, and this is just to add more beef to the snare. And then the difference is for the bottom. Let's see, here is the bottom snare. You can see the high pass, low pass, nothing on the EQ there, just up a little bit at 3.7 kilohertz, pulling back some of the boxiness at 380 hertz. And then let's see, we're boosting up some of that beef at 138 hertz as well. And we are using a little bit of compression here, 4:1 ratio, negative 10.2 dB. And let's see what kind of gain reduction we're getting. Basically, it's not even registering at -3, so it's doing not much of anything. And then we go into the virtual mix rack, and you can see settings here. Do note this compressor is turned off. In fact, I can just get rid of it. But we're just doing a little bit of EQ and then adding some revival here, which is essentially low end and top end. And then that's what that's doing. Let's see, we're doing transgressor 2, transient, sustain again. And then you can see all the settings there. And then we're doing spiff, and it's the exact same settings as on the top. And then the gain again is -14. And of course we're sending to the punch and the room buses, and again we'll get to those in a little bit. But let's go ahead and just solo these snares, and just so you can hear just the snare, I need to make sure I mute all my buses and sends and stuff over here so that we get just the snare top, and this is what they sound like. So that's just the bottom. And that's the top. And so let me go ahead and turn off. I'm gonna go ahead and turn off all of the plugins, and then I'll turn it on so you can hear the difference this has. So I'm keeping the gain on, just it's simply volume. So this is the snare without any of the processing. And as I said, notice because of that top-down approach on the mixing I'm doing, all that top end like sizzle and snap is really coming through strong. In fact, it's a little bit too strong for me, and that's where that EQ pulling out some of that top end was important. And then you notice how all the beef in the snare just kind of fell out, right? Like there's no beef. So if I add these plugins back, you're going to hear all that low end beef kind of come back into the snare. So there you go. So that is the snare. Now, moving on to the toms. Now, there are like, what, 6 toms here? This is going to take forever to run through all the settings for all the toms and sample, like, you know, before and after. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to very quickly click on each of the plugins in each of the channel strips for the toms. In fact, the processing that I'm doing is almost identical across all the toms. It just changes slightly depending on if it's a higher tom or a lower tom, like a floor tom. So I'm gonna pull those all up so you can see them. I'm gonna do it quickly, and then I'll just do a quick before and after of maybe like one of the higher toms, and then one of the lower toms if I can find one of the drum fills in here that has them. So that's what I'm gonna do just to kind of keep things moving here. So this is the first tom. I'm gonna go ahead and pull all of these up, and this is the Infinity EQ. You can see across the bottom here is like the frequency range, and then along the left is how much I'm adding or subtracting from those frequencies, so you can see all of that there. I'm not going to read everything. And then you can see the Slate Digital Virtual Mix Rack. We've got some EQ revival and a little bit of a compression happening there. And then we go into the BX Saturator. And this is just adding some saturation and some really, so in a way that adds some good like snap, like stick attack across all of the toms. This is across all the toms. You'll see this on all of them. But that's just kind of a neat trick that I picked up, I think from Nolly at some point, watching one of his videos, where he was using, what is it, FabFilter Saturn, which is another form of saturation on his toms, and I really liked it, so that's where I started using it here, using the BX Saturator. And as you can see, the processing is identical across all the toms. It's just some of the settings that are different. So here is Tom 2 and the EQ curves there. The virtual mix rack, you can see all the settings there. The BX Saturator, there's all the settings there. Keeping moving, we've got tom number 3, a little bit of a different EQ curve there. Virtual mix rack. A lot of these settings are almost identical on the virtual mix racks, and then the BX Saturator as well. Let's see, we've got infinity EQ for tom number 4. Quite a bit of boxiness in this lower mid area I'm cutting out. And then we've got virtual mix rack, which again looks very similar to the others. And the BX Saturator, oops, got rid of it. And there it is, you can see all the settings there. And let's see, we've got floor tom 2, again with the lower mids, boxiness, pulling that out. Then we've got virtual mix rack. Again, all of these are almost identical. BX Saturator, and the last floor tom, and you can see EQ there. Again, the lower mids pulling out all that boxiness. Virtual mix rack, again with almost identical settings, I think. And the BX Saturator, again with similar settings. So those are all the settings for all the toms. I at least wanted to pull them up so you can see them, and you can pause the video and dive into each of those settings more specifically if you'd like to. All right, so I found a little drum fill here that shows a couple of the higher toms, the rack mount toms. So here's what they sound like with the processing. And here is what they sound like without any processing. That is quite the difference, wouldn't you say? Again, here they are without any processing. And here they are with the processing again. Yeah, quite the difference. So that is the processing that I did to the toms. And again, all of these toms are also going to the punch bus and the room bus. So again, we'll get to those in a little bit. All right, next up, hi-hat. And we're gonna kind of burn through this because this is taking a while. So the very first thing we have is the channel strip. You can see the settings here. Let's see, we've got high pass, low pass. We've got high settings on the EQ, mid EQ, low mid EQ here. And some of the lows and some dynamics. You can see we've got fast attack. We've got 4:1 ratio. You can see the threshold, the release. And those are the settings on the channel strip. Then we're going into Soothe 2, which is a dynamic processor, dynamic EQ, if you will. It will find the harsh frequencies based on the curves that you have selected here and automatically dip those out. So this is what it looks like. There you go. You can see it's like automatically finding those harsh frequencies and dipping those out based on the curves that I've defined. And let's see, then we go into one of my all-time favorite plugins is the Black Box Analog Design HG2. They also have an HG2 MS mid-side version we'll get to in a minute on some other stuff, but this is essentially another form of saturation. And so I'm adding a little bit of saturation there. And then the last thing is just pulling back some of the gain. And that's it. That's how I'm processing the hi-hat. Now, next up, we have the ride cymbal. And you can see the settings we've got here on the channel strip. We're doing some EQ. I'm just kind of hovering over these so you can at least see the numbers there. Pulling back some of the low mids, pulling back some of the lows. Add some dynamics, 10:1 ratio this time. You can see the threshold and the release. And that is the EQ and compression in the channel strip. Then we do Soothe 2 again. We'll you can see where we're just kind of pulling back some of those harsh frequencies. Looks like it's between 1.6 kilohertz and 9 kilohertz, just kind of pulling back some of that dynamically just to try and take out some of those harsh frequencies. And then we've got black box HG2 again with the saturation and the gain, just pulling back some of that. That's the ride. Then we go, then we have the cymbals, and where you can see, again, I'm just going to hover over these so you can see the settings. And let's see, pulling back quite a bit on 450 kilohertz, pulling that back a ton, pulling back 600 a ton. I think this is just because I just didn't want any of this low end in the cymbals whatsoever. And then we've got dynamics here, 8:1 ratio. You can see the threshold and the release. And that is the channel strip. Then we go into Soothe 2 again, exact same as previously on the ride cymbal. And then we're adding some saturation here as well. And then the gain, we're pulling that back a bit. And let's see, we've got overheads here. I'm going to kind of burn through this one. You can see the channel strip settings here in the EQ. Again, just hovering over everything so you can read the individual values and pause the video and dive into this deeper if you want to. Dynamics, 3:1 ratio, threshold and release. And then we go to Soothe 2. Again, the exact same as the cymbals. And then we've got black box adding a little bit of saturation. This EQ I had added just for monitoring. Sometimes I'll do that just to kind of monitor the frequency spectrum and the EQ curve, and then be able to pan to the mid and side and left and right and all of that. So in fact, I can just get rid of that. It's not doing anything. Then we've got the overhead, pulling that back a little bit on the gain here. And that's how I'm processing my overheads. All right, so that is all of the individual pieces of the kit. Now, we're going to go ahead and jump into the buses and start talking about some of the techniques and the more advanced things that I'm doing here to process these drums in a way that add width and enhance the sound of the mix overall. And we're going to start with my drums summing track. And so this is essentially what all of the tracks that we just went over, they sum up into. And so this is essentially a bus where all of those individual tracks, all of the sound or all of the output is just routing into this bus. And then from there, it goes into kind of the main mix from there. And so the individual processing that's happening here on this drums track stack or summing track stack, which is again essentially just a bus. We have the solid state logic bus compressor, and you can see the individual settings that I've got there. And then we've got the virtual mix rack. Hold down here where you can see it. Virtual mix bus. Then we've got some Neve EQ happening here, and then we've got this this comes from the Slate Digital as well. That Eosis Air EQ. I'm not sure how you say that, but it's essentially another EQ. And the reason I use this is because of this strength slider and how easy it is just to automate that. And that's what I use for the intro of this, where it sounds almost like it's coming from, like you're listening to it through a telephone, and then it fades into the full sound. It was just by automating this strength slider. So that's what that's there for. And the next bus we're going to look at is the punch bus, and I will remind you that the kick, the snare top, the snare bottom, and all of the toms are being sent to it, and you can see the individual levels that they are being sent to there. And specifically, I'm sending post pan on all of these. And what I'm going to need to do here is zoom out so you can see the bus, and you can see we have spiff here and the virtual mix rack and gain, and I'm just going to open them all up so we can burn through this. You can see I've got negative 13.2 pulled back on the gain. For virtual mix rack, you can see all the settings I've got here. I've got a virtual channel, FGN Neve EQ. We've got another distressor. We've got the Monster, which is an extreme dynamics processor is what it's labeled, essentially just a compressor, but it is pretty crazy. And note that I've only got 20%, 19.5, I think it was 20, something like that. It's about 20% going output from this compressor. That's how crazy this thing is. And then some revival as well. And then we've got spiff again, and this is again just to add some punch to the sound. Again, this is the punch bus. That's its purpose. And I've already got things soloed so that you can hear what this is doing. So I'm going to go ahead and play this back. So there you go. You can hear there's not a ton of sustain on anything. It's just super punchy. That is the purpose of this punch bus. And then what I do is just blend that back in with the rest of the mix, with the rest of the drums, until I can hear it coming through, adding a little bit of punch without it getting too overpowering. And that's why you can hear it's a little bit softer. I'll increase the volume for the video, but just know that when it's actually in the mix, it's quieter than what you're going to hear it in the video. So that is the punch bus. And the next bus we're going to look at is the verb bus. I'm not going to go through in detail how I do this because I actually have an entire video dedicated to this that I will link to up in the corner. So go check that out to see all the settings on how I do this. So we're going to go ahead and keep moving in this video though. So all right, and so the next bus we're going to look at is the drum rooms bus. And this is really where a lot of the magic in my drum mixes really kind of starts to come together, is through the drum rooms. It's really what adds the width and the spaciousness and just kind of pulls everything together in my drum sounds. So let's go ahead and start taking a look at how this works. So this bus is actually receiving signal from a couple different things. It's receiving signal from this track here, which is called room. This is all the room outputs from Get Good Drums Invasion, the drum VST I'm using. All of the drum rooms, all the drum room sounds come out to this track. And then I'm routing that through this bus here, this bus send, which is pre-fader into this bus, the drum room bus. Now, why is it pre-fader? Well, that's because I didn't want any of the original sound to come through in my mix. I only want the processed sound from my bus. And so then you'd think, well, why wouldn't you just set up these, this processing you're doing on this track? Well, that's because I have more than just this track going into this bus. And that's because you can see over here, I have this snare room, and this is coming from a sample, and we're going to get into the samples in just a second, so stick around for that. But this is a way to add room reinforcement via samples. So I've got this sample drum room going into this bus, as with all of the drum room sounds coming from GGD Invasion. So all of those are going pre-fader into this bus, and then that way I can control how much of each of these go into that bus through this level here. And you can see this one is at negative 2.4, and the sample is at negative 9.4. All right, so now we're just going to go ahead and take a look at the processing that I'm doing in this bus. And you can see here we're doing some mid-side EQing. And let's see, the blue is side. So if it's blue, I'm only making it's only affecting the side of my signal, not the center. And if it's yellow, it's mono. So you can see here we're affecting more of this of the center than the sides, but it is affecting a little bit of both on this one. And then my high pass is only on the sides. So I don't want the low end, like from the kick drum and the floor toms and whatnot, coming through the sides. That should be mono up the center, so I'm just cutting it from the sides. And then I've got a low pass of everything at like say 13.9 kilohertz. And so that is what's happening. This one here is actually turned off, so you can ignore that. Then we had a resonant frequency here at 310 hertz. I had to cut some of that out as well. So that is the EQ on the drum rooms. And then we go into the virtual, the Slate Digital Virtual Bus Compressor plugin. This is a series of different compressors, and I'm not actually doing any compression with this. The reason that I have this on here is because of this this FGMU, which is this bottom compressor. And actually, I'll zoom my screen in here again so you can see this a little better. So this compressor on the bottom, this FGMU, it has some crazy processing that this is doing. They actually describe it on their website and in the manual with this thing. But the emulation built into this actually does some like top end sweetening and almost like a form of saturation, if you will, is the best way I can describe it. But I'll go ahead and play and solo the drum rooms and turn this on and off, and you can really hear what it's doing. But that's why I added this, is just to kind of add that sweetening to the sound without any compression at all. It's just on, no compression. Where the compression comes in is right here, the SSL native bus compressor, and you can see what we're doing here. And I believe this is actually doing some pretty significant compression. I believe it's going maybe around a -10 to -12 dB. And the purpose in that is, in my drum rooms, I don't care much about like the actual transients. I want more of the sustain, which is why I'm using a bit of a faster attack here and a fast release, is to kind of tame some of the transient, but just give me that long sustain and decay from the drum rooms. And that helps add that spaciousness to the sound. So that's everything happening here. So let me go ahead and solo this so you can hear it. So you can really hear how that snare is kind of, you know, really ringing out, right? So let me go ahead and now I'm going to turn off all of the processing and now listen to this massive difference. Hear how we just lost a lot of that sustain. So again, I'm going to turn it all back on, and then what I'll do is let it play, and I'll turn on and off the VBC compressor here, which I was talking about, is adding that kind of form of saturation and sweetness, if you will, so you can hear what that is doing. Yeah, you can hear it. It's clear how it's adding some form of like top end sweetness there, and I think it sounds fantastic. I really liked it, so I kept it there simply for that effect or that sound. Now, as for the actual amount of compression that's happening here on this native bus compressor on these drum rooms, let's go ahead and take a look at that. Looks like it maybe got up around -8 is where it's peaking, not quite -10. Looks like at about -8 or so we're peaking. And again, if I turn this off, notice we lose all that sustain without it. So that is the purpose of the compressor. And as you can hear, that this is doing a lot, right? Like, it's adding a ton of sustain, that top end sweetening from the bus compressor, and we're doing some mid-side EQ, which is helping to expand the sound here from these rooms. So let me play back just the drums soloed again, and I've got the drum bus now, this drum room bus muted, and listen to the difference with this muted and when I turn it on. Absolutely massive difference with having that drum room off. So as I mentioned, this is kind of where a lot of the magic in my drum mixes come in, is through the drum rooms. So that is how I kind of pull this whole thing together and add a huge, massive sound to the drums, is through these drum rooms. All right, y'all, we are almost through this. The last thing I want to show is the drum samples, because this is also very important to my drum mixes these days. And specifically, that is, I'm using the Bogren digital drum samples as reinforcement for the kick drum, the snare drum, and the drum rooms. In fact, the drum room snare sound you just heard is probably 98 to 99% a drum sample from Bogren Digital's drum samples. All right, and so let's go ahead and take a look at the samples now, starting with the kick. And this is the Harder Please sample from Bogren Digital, and as you can see, I'm using their NKI contact instrument with that with 2.9 positive on the direct and negative 2.9 on the ambience, which is essentially the rooms. This is going into SSL channel strip 2, and you can see the settings we've got on the EQ here. I'll just kind of quickly hover over everything, and those are the settings. There's no dynamics happening. And then the gain, we're just pulling back some level here, and I'll solo the kick here just real quick so you can hear what it sounds like. That is it. That's the kick. And when we blend that with the GGD kick, we get this. So that's the overall kick sound. Now we'll move on to the snare. This is the snare sample, again, from Bogren Digital. This is the wanker snare, and notice there is no ambience or room sounds on this. It's all direct. That is because I'm using a different sample for the rooms. So we'll get to that in just a second. You can see we're going to channel strip 2. We've got these settings here. Let's see, that's the EQ, upper mids, no lower mid changes, no lows, no dynamics. So that's basically it. Just pulling back some of the level on the gain. And this is what the snare top sounds like. That's it. Absolutely fantastic sounding snare. Now, the drum room sample is the super nice. And again, notice there's no direct. This is all just the ambience or just the room. And this is going into channel strip 2. You can see the settings that I've got here. Again, just hovering over them quickly. And no dynamics. And then we are sending this into the drum rooms bus, as I mentioned earlier. And so if we just solo this, we will just hear this through that drum room bus. And this is what just the drum room snare sounds like from the Bogren Digital sample. Love that drum room sound. Absolutely love that. So again, that's the super nice with the settings on the drum room bus that I showed earlier. And then the last sample I'm going to show is the last one I'm using, which is the Spike Me In sample. And this is just an effect sample, if you will. It's not actually like a snare. It's just a quick snap sound. And here's the processing that's happening on that. We're going into the SSL compressor, I'm sorry, the SSL channel strip, and there is nothing happening here, just pulling back some of the level. And then we go into BX Saturator to add some crispy snap on the top end, some rounded saturation across the mid side here with the black box analog to design HG2 MS, and then pulling back some of the level via the gain plugin. Let's go ahead and just hear all of what makes up our snare drum. So that is the snap. Then we have the snare room. Then we have the snare sample from Bogren Digital, which is kind of our reinforcements. Then we have the snare bottom from GGD and the snare top from GGD. And this makes up the entire snare. Absolutely love the way that turned out. So nice crispy snap, beautiful sustain from the room, and it's got lots of body and beef. I absolutely love it. So those are all the samples and how I'm using the Bogren Digital samples as reinforcement with the GGD drums. All right, everyone, that is it. I know this is a long one. I know this is a lot of information and a lot of just me showing plugins on the screen and quickly running through those settings. But I felt this was an important one because I've had a lot of comments on my videos, especially recently, about how big and massive the drums sound. And in order to be able to show you how I do it, I've got to run through all this information to go over it all, right? To share that with you. So that's why I did this video, and hopefully you found that helpful. If you did, go ahead and hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel if you're not already a subscriber for more like this in the future. And as always, thank you for watching and thank you for your support.